A reading from the Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus came down with the 12 and stood on a stretch of level ground with a great crowd of his disciples and a large number of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon. And raising his eyes towards his disciples, he said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for the kingdom of God is yours. Blessed are you who are now hungry, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who are now weeping, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude and insult you, and denounce your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice and leap for joy on that day. Behold, your reward will be great in heaven. For their ancestors treated the prophets in the same way. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are filled now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will grieve and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for their ancestors treated the false prophets in this way. This is the good news from our brother Jesus. Praise
to you, Jesus the Christ.
Have a seat. Well, you may have noticed that our presidential stand-in, Elon Musk, is often seen with his 3-year-old son named X, claiming that X has a calming influence in his life. A 3-year-old child is his daddy's security blanket, if you will. Our imaginations lead us to wonder what anxieties this dominant force named Elon Musk is experiencing. Our first reading from Jeremiah gives us a hint, as it reveals something about the condition of the human heart. Here and in our gospel reading, we see a pattern common in the wisdom tradition of contrasting what is good with what is bad, what to do and what not to do, the consequences of wise choices and the consequences of being unwise. And we are called in Jeremiah to examine the role of trust. A study of basic human development reminds us that according to psychologist Erik Erikson, trust versus mistrust is the first stage of psychosocial development beginning at birth. It's a most crucial period in a child's life as it shapes their view of our world, as well as their overall personality. Having someone in our lives we can trust allows us to develop empathy, to have a balanced and secure identity, to engage others with healthy boundaries, to regulate our emotional reactions, to take responsibility for our personal needs. Saint Therese of Lisieux knew what it was like to lose her source of attachment and trust. At age 4, her mother died of breast cancer after an 11-year battle with the disease. Therese suffered tremendous trauma and grief from losing her mom, changing her once happy disposition into one of gloom and sadness, transferring her reliance from her mother to a doting father, and to an innate awareness of the love of God. We all require that one consistent person who shows up, who provides for our basic needs in a dependable and nurturing way. Most of us were fortunate to have that in our lives, while others have been on a lifelong pursuit trying to fill what can feel like a bottomless pit of relational needs, seeking that which they have never really known. Elon Musk is a child of divorce, according to Wikipedia. His parents split up when he was 9 years old. He elected to live with his father, whom he was eventually estranged from. His father recalls as a child, Elon had a significant amount of insensitivity towards other children, often referring to them as stupid. And once fighting with a child whose father had just committed suicide. And so we see a broken man with a history of severed attachments. But you don't have to live long to figure out that many humans will disappoint you, that we will experience irreconcilable differences. We will hope that the love given will be the love returned, only to find out that it can't. It won't. And so it is with God. If our image of God is unrealistic, if our expectations are simply a projection of what we believe we need, rather than based on the true nature of God, like the idea that God is a magic genie, our wish is his command, or that God is like karma, and those who hurt us will get what they have coming to them in the end. That does not always happen, does it? And so let's unpack this first reading, starting with the images that Jeremiah provides us for understanding what our lives look like when we place our trust in God, and placing our trust solely on one another. The one who turns away from God is like a barren bush in the desert, standing in lava waste, a salt and empty earth. But the one who trusts in God, whose hope is in God, is like a tree planted beside the waters that stretches out its roots into the stream. It fears not the heat when it comes. Its leaves stay green in the year of drought. It shows no distress, but still bears fruit. Do you feel like we are perhaps in a year of drought? It is hard to hope in anything that will rescue us from our current time of crises. To bear fruit at a time like this almost seems antithetical to the realities that we are living in. It would be like joy in the midst of grief, as if to be joyful would be a mockery of the loss we've experienced, an insult to the dead. Perhaps as a nation, a period of sackcloth and ashes is warranted before we learn to trust in any path forward. But God isn't promising us that there won't be difficult days. Here we see Judah's leaders forming an alliance with Egypt against the Babylonians. Jeremiah is telling them to trust God and not political and military alliances, a plan that would seem like passivity rather than resistance. I admit that my friends and fellow pastors who are coping with this current political situation in America by forming book clubs and increasing their self-care are driving me a bit nuts. It feels like a time to fight, not a time to turn inward. But perhaps their intentional connections to friends and some kind of meaningful sharing is just what God is calling us to do. To be in relationship, to build communities. But contrary to my instinct to fight in Jeremiah's era, as it turns out, the attempt to fight back prompted the Babylonians to dig in their heels, to tighten their grip, eventually destroying the city and the temple and sending the Judeans, including Jeremiah, into exile. There are no easy solutions, and God does not promise that trusting in God will rescue us from hardships. The books of Job and Ecclesiastes teach us that obedience, trust, and wisdom do not lead necessarily to outward success or prosperity. Jesus says in our gospel reading, "Woe to you who have it good now, for one day you too will know troubles. For the sun shines on the evil and on the good. The rain falls on the just and the unjust." God does not rescue us as much as God accompanies us. God says, "I am with you always." As nice as it was to believe when we were children that our parents would chase away the boogeyman, we have each had our own encounters with that boogeyman, haven't we? Our own tragic events, times of loss and disappointment, times that have challenged us beyond our abilities to cope. And if we have never experienced relational trust, then we are like the barren tree, trying to root ourselves in lava rock. But if we have the security that comes from a trustworthy relationship, whether we gain our security first from our parents or ultimately from God, we have resilience to weather the storms in our lives. We can even flourish in the midst of those storms. Psychologist Christine Runyon reminds us of our innate responses to trauma, the impulses of fight, flight, or freeze. But she adds an additional response that comes from the amygdala when we are under a perceived threat. The response to affiliate, to reach out, to be within a community. It is reinforced by bursts of oxytocin and dopamine. It is the impulse to tend and befriend. We seek out the company of others when we experience trauma, and we pull those we love in to tend to them. It's our survival instinct to do our part, to care for others. We saw this during COVID, neighbors in an Italian neighborhood singing with one another out of their balconies, hearts taped to windows of homes, expressing love to those they couldn't have contact with. We are created for relationships. I was watching an episode of Queer Eye the other night. It is one of my favorite late night binges. 5 gay men who go into the worlds of people whose lives are disordered, whose self-esteem is low, whose need for a haircut and a fresh wardrobe benefit from the visionary skills of these delightful makeover artists. In a recent episode, they visited a kids' summer camp, and they made over the camp director. It reminded me of summer camp when I was a kid, all of us strangers at the beginning of the week, parents dropping us off with suitcases in hand, bunked together in rugged cabins, camp food and fun days spent outdoors, swimming, archery, campfires, and by the end of the week, each kid treasuring the friendships formed. It's what we do. We are made to be connected to others. But there has been a drastic shift in our culture. Some blame it on COVID, but I think the roots go further back. A large part of our social and emotional development today occurs while we are on the internet and on our cell phones, drastically reducing experiences of face-to-face communication and in-person activities. For those of us who grew up being told to go outside and play on a hot summer afternoon rather than sitting with our noses in our computers, our life experiences and our methods of managing life are quite different from the 19 to 22-year-old techies who are managing many of the executive orders coming out of the White House these days. CNN reported on February 13th that Elon Musk plans to replaced many federal workers with sources of artificial intelligence. Elon Musk appears to be a part of the Silicon Valley techno-optimist group of computer enthusiasts who believe that nothing can nor should slow down the development and implementation of artificial intelligence. They are called AI accelerationists, a movement that grew out of sci-fi novels of the 1970s. An article titled Accelerationists, How a Fringe Philosophy Predicted the Future We Live In, written by Andy Beckett, says, accelerationists argue that technology and capitalism, particularly the most aggressive global variety, should be massively sped up and intensified. Accelerationists favor automation. They favor the further merging of digital and the human. They often favor the deregulation of business and drastically scaled back government. They believe that people should stop deluding themselves, that economic and technological progress can be controlled. They often believe that social and political upheaval has a value in itself. Accelerationism goes against conservatism, traditional socialism, social democracy, environmentalism, protectionism, populism, nationalism, localism, and all the other ideologies that have sought to moderate or reverse the already hugely disruptive, seemingly runaway pace of change in the modern world. Does this sound familiar? But where's the love? Jesus, in his message to disciples, gathers with them on a plain, not on a lofty mountain where they hear the voice of God, but down in the plains where everyday people live and work and hang around. His words were as much for their benefit as they were for the disciples. Be with your people. Know their pain. See them as God sees them. Behold the poor, the hungry, the weeping, the excluded. Behold the love that the Father has for such as these. Watch out for those trappings in life, those times when you are wealthy and fed, laughing and surrounded by your fans. The higher you climb, the harder you will fall. Jesus calls us not to disengage from human contact, from relationships that endure the test of time and the hardships of life. Jesus asks us to keep it real, to not live in some alternative universe, but to plant our feet in the ground of reality, to engage in the messiness of life, to accompany others through their trials and tribulations, to be resilient. And when those assigned to love us early in life teach us to bond, to trust, and to be able to trust in the love of others, it's good. But when they fail, God says, trust in me. God who is always present, Yahweh, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. Imagine the world of Elon Musk where humans are replaced by machines. And you begin to understand the callous elimination of programs like USAID, Medicare, the Department of Education, diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender-affirming care for children, school lunch programs, and food assistance. Pope Francis weighed in on this cultural shift we are experiencing, giving our Vice President a lesson from the Catechism. He says the human person is not a mere individual, relatively expansive with some philanthropic feelings. The human person is a subject with dignity, who through the constitutive relationship with all, especially with the poorest, can gradually mature in his identity and vocation. The true ordo amoris that must be promoted is that which we discover by meditating constantly on the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is, by meditating on the love that builds a fraternity open to all, without exception. When we have been hit hard by the events that overwhelm us, we can spread our roots deep into the stream of God's love, fearing not the heat when it comes. In this year of drought, we can still bear fruit. We can have the resilience we long for because we know whose we are and what we are called to do.
Amen.